Chapter 8. A New Life Begins. The journey to London was achieved in 5 hours in a 4-horse stagecoach. Normally, such a big city would have frightened me if it were not for its dirt and the ugliness of its narrow, crooked streets. Strange as it may sound, this made me feel more comfortable. On my arrival, I made my way to Mr. Jagger's office instantly and he briefed me about my allowance details. I must admit that the sum on offer did seem astronomical at that time. He also provided me with business cards of various tailors and tradesmen who would give me credit and send the bill to Mr. Jaggers after rendering their services. This would not only be convenient but would also permit him to keep a track on my spending. He ordered his clerk, Mr. Wemmick, to guide me to my rooms, which I was to share with young Herbert Pocket. Mr. Wemmick was short and dry, but his eyes were sharp and shining in contrast. He took me to Bernard's Inn, a cluster of buildings surrounding a courtyard. We entered a building and walked upstairs to the rooms which were located on the top floor. A note which said, "Back soon," was stuck over the mailbox. We went in as the door was unlocked. "Well, here we are," announced Mr. Wemmick. "You don't need anything more as of now, but since I'm in charge of Mr. Jagger's cash box, I'm sure we'll meet very often." I thanked him and he went on his way. I examined my new quarters, which were fairly large, but I realized the fact that they had little furniture in them, which made them appear larger than they really were. They were also not very clean, but then again, they did belong to a bachelor, in this case bachelors. After 20 minutes had elapsed, I heard footsteps in the hall and a pale youth entered. He was carrying a container of strawberries. He was panting, but inquired smilingly, "Mr. Pip?" "Yes, Mr. Pocket," I smiled back. I apologize for being out, but I wasn't sure the time your stage got in, and a sudden thought struck me that you might prefer some fresh fruit to go with your dinner. So I dashed out." Herbert Pocket apologized for not having been present to receive me. This was the first sign of Herbert's kindness that I experienced. He didn't even listen to my thanks as he rattled on about our living arrangements. The coffee house next door supplied us our meals. Mr. Jaggers had made all arrangements so that I could pay for my meals. This was because Herbert was poor, although he was a gentleman. He admitted this with such frankness and cheerfulness that my liking for him grew with every passing minute. As his bank job paid him probably very poorly, the furnishings were meagre. By the time I had unpacked, a waiter had brought up a delicious dinner comprising of melted butter, crusty bread, cheese, and chicken. The dinner seemed particularly satisfactory as I was independent. No older people were around to supervise over me, and because I was finally in London. I did not know if Herbert was aware of my story from Mr. Jaggers or Miss Havisham, perhaps as she was his relation. But I decided to tell him everything on my own, which took an hour. I concluded by requesting him to correct my manners and introduce me to the proper London ways. In return, Herbert narrated to me Miss Havenshaw's story, while we had dinner. Her mother passed away when she was small and her father spoilt her. He left her a fortune, but, by the way, Pip, in London, it's not customary to put your knife in your mouth. The fork is used to serve that purpose. It is a minor suggestion. He said the last bit with such a liveliness that I did not blush as I normally would have, but thanked him instead. Herbert continued with his story. Miss Havisham fell in love with a man whom my father didn't trust. She gave him huge sums of money during the engagement. But on the wedding day, he broke off the marriage by sending her a letter. She received it at 9:20 when she was dressing. I interrupted him. Precisely, said Herbert. She stopped all the clocks and everything was left untouched to this day. Dear Pip, a small matter, but you need not empty your wine glass so deeply that it has to rest on your nose. Herbert corrected me again. I put my glass down quickly and thanked him again. But why didn't the man marry Miss Havisham and control all her money? I asked. No one knows, but we suspect he was already married. He had been untrue towards her from the very beginning and never really loved her, Herbert explained. Poor Miss Havisham. I shook my head sadly. My poor benefactor. Chapter 9. A visitor for Pip. The following day, Herbert took time off from his job at the bank to take me to his father's house, where he intended to introduce me to him. My tutor's face was youthful, although his hair was grey. His smile and mannerism were exactly like Herbert's, and I liked him instantly. I also met 2 other students of his, whom I was supposed to receive my lessons with. Startop was the friendly and good nature, and I liked him, but Bentley Dremel and I hated each other at first sight. I discovered later that Bentley Dremel disliked almost everybody else, mostly as he considered himself far superior for ordinary company. He was related to aristocracy, but his sulky behavior was reflective of rudeness. He reminded me of a large spider and was probably as unpleasant. Mr. Pocket began my education process by telling me about the famous sites and places I should visit in London. I also decided to surprise Herbert by changing the depressing decor of the rooms and Bernard's Inn by purchasing new furniture, rugs and curtains. Mr. Jaggers laughed when I confided in him about my plan. I knew you'll catch up on a city life pretty soon. How much would you need? He inquired. I had absolutely no idea how much money I would need, as I wondered about how much money I should ask him. Mr. Jaggers' housekeeper brought in his lunch. She was a tall woman who was about 40 years old with a large faded eyes. She didn't seem perfectly normal as she kept looking at Mr. Jaggers in an entreating way, as if she wanted to ask him something but didn't dare to do. I finally named an amount and Mr. Jaggers called Mr. Wemmick in and instructed him to count out the money for me. Herbert was absolutely thrilled with the amazing transformation of our rooms when it happened and shook my hands many times in a day for the next week to express his delight. After the redecoration of our rooms was over, I learnt that I would have a visitor, one who wouldn't be able to differentiate between my lovely oriental rug and the ugly carpet in my sister's parlour. Biddy had written to me about Joe's keenness to visit me, and my return letter confirmed the date and his arrival. But the truth was that I didn't want to see Joe. I would have even paid the good man to stay away from me if I could. How on earth could I tell him that I wasn't the Pip he had once known? How on earth could I explain my transformation from a poor boy on the marshes to a gentleman in the society? I heard him climbing the stairs on the particular day. I thought he would never finish wiping his feet when he reached the door, and I was considering lifting him bodily from the mat. He came in finally with a radiant face and grabbed my hands. He moved them up and down as if I was some kind of a new pump he had discovered. I offered to take his hat, which I noticed was a new one, but Joe held on to it as if it was a precious stone. Joe was speechless as his eyes went around the room and then around the flowered pattern of my dressing gown. I was actually relieved when Herbert walked in, followed by a waiter who set the table for a meal. Joe was forced to give his hat before we sat down to eat. He put it on a corner of the mantel above the fireplace, from where it fell periodically. "Would you prefer coffee or tea, Mr. Gregory?" Herbert asked politely, ready to pour out whichever Joe wanted. Joe was stiff all over as he replied, "Thank you, sir. I take whichever you find agreeable." "Oh, what do you say to coffee then?" Herbert offered. "Thank you, sir." Joe looked unhappy with Herbert's choice. "Since you are so kind to make a choice of coffee, I shall not go contrary to your opinion. But don't you feel it heats up one a little?" he asked. "It shall be tea then," Herbert replied, pouring it out. Joe's hat fell off the mantel just then, and he jumped up from his seat to return it to the precise spot. As we ate, Joe seemed to be gripped by inexplicable fits of meditation, just as his fork had reached midway between his plate and his mouth. He coughed in a strange manner and was seated so far away from the table that he dropped more food than he ate. I am glad that Herbert left us. It was my entire fault in a way. I should have been more relaxed with Joe for him to have been relaxed in his new surroundings. "Us two now being alone, sir," Joe began. "Please, Joe," I interrupted with anger. "How can you call me, sir?" He cast his eyes downwards. "It was wrong on my part to have come here, Pip. I'm all wrong in these clothes. I belong in the forge and on the marshes. I know that I'm awfully dull, but if you should ever want to see old Joe, all you have to do is come and put your head in the old forge window like you used to do. Goodbye, dear old Pip. May God bless you," said Joe, and was gone. I was full of shame for many weeks after Joe's visit. This feeling was heightened even further when I received the news of my sister's death, but there was also a strange relief. Many years later, when I was 20 years old, I received some good news which was connected to my past. It came from Mr. Jaggers, and it was splendid news. It was from Estella, who had just returned from France and was on her way to live in London. She had invited me to call upon her.